You go to the grocery store, you get your cart, and you're ready to check out. And there's a few different things you encounter when you check out. One is like you go through the express lane and there's the long line, and then there's like the 4 different people who are checking people out as you go through, right? Or you go scan the set of folks that can check you out if you have more than 15 items, and you go pick the shortest line and then cross your fingers and you watch everybody else go faster than you. But there's actually math behind that. The most efficient way to handle a big list of things, a large queue, is to have multiple people taking from a single queue. That's why the express lanes are set up that way.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Hayes Davis. Hayes is the CEO and founder of GradientWorks, where they are creating the CRO operating system. And in our conversation today, we talk about the concept of revenue orchestration. And we dig into why companies are perhaps too quick to blame reps for being unproductive, but then don't examine whether they've orchestrated a system and process that enables reps to be effective. Hayes and I also dive into his method for evaluating the revenue potential of accounts. And it's all based on timing and fit. And we get into a discussion of his quadrant, using timing and fit, that anyone can quickly use to evaluate the potential of an opportunity and use it to make better decisions about where and when to invest your limited sales time. Now, do all the accounts you're selling to reside in what Hayes calls the good place? Well, you'll want them to. So all that and much, much more coming up. Before we get to Hayes, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could also give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Hayes, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're joining us from where today?
From sunny Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
So, yeah, sort of pre-tornado season.
That's right. Post snowpocalypse season. So we had some pretty tremendous weather.
Did you have to boil water? Were you affected by that?
Yeah, we had that whole thing. We had about 3 days with no electricity and then boiling water for about a week. It was very interesting. I would say we're not typically equipped for that type of weather here.
That type of developing country conditions, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, most of the time I will say we have running water, we have electricity. It's almost always there.
Yeah, right at the top of the scale. Perfect. Mm-hmm. So tell us a bit about Gradient, your company.
Yeah, so GradientWorks is relatively new, all things considered. We've been around for, about 9 months now, and it's really born out of our experience running go-to-market teams over the last decade or so. Mm-hmm. And so really the problem we're focused on initially is one of the problems that I think is really misunderstood and undervalued in revenue organizations, and that's the idea of ownership. One of the things that I think we miss when we think about how we're building a revenue organization at scale is thinking about, okay, who is responsible for what opportunity, what lead, what account, when throughout the customer lifecycle. And it's actually such an important thing conceptually that we don't even talk about it as ownership or assignment in a lot of cases. We talk about it by proxy. We talk about it as territories or customer segmentation or something like that. But when you think about
account list, right? Yeah.
Yeah, your book, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have kind of all these names for it. But when you're thinking about what a CRO or a VP of sales needs to be thinking about in a relatively high velocity B2B sales motion, a big part of their job is designing and managing how reps are assigned to different parts of the sales cycle. And so I know, I think you've had a background where you've done a lot of enterprise sales, for example. I saw a post of yours on LinkedIn the other day where you mentioned, you don't do an enterprise deal by yourself, right? You bring in a lot of other folks to do that deal. And so a lot of the design of your organization is about understanding who else needs to come into that deal? Who needs to be assigned? Do I need an SE? Do I need some product overlay or something like that? As well as kind of staging things along the customer lifecycle. Often an inbound will have a BDR attached to them at first. That person will do some qualification. They'll go to an AE. That person will go, and then ultimately, if you close the deal, they go to an AM or a CSM. There's all these different stages that folks go through. And one of the things that I've seen in these organizations is that there really needs to be a way to start thinking about that problem holistically and ultimately to start optimizing that problem for the productivity and velocity of your entire organization. And I think it's a fundamental part of how your organization works.
Okay, so if somebody's not doing that, what's occurring? What are the symptoms of not doing this you described?
So what I'll say is this is one of those things where, if you asked any organization if you're assigning people to accounts or opportunities or whatever, sure, they'll say, yes, we are, right? But what they're often not doing is optimizing it. And so here's an example that I see. We've in our beta programs for our assignment product, we've worked with a number of companies that have a really good problem, which is that they have a lot of inbounds, right? And so you got a lot of inbounds. One of your big challenges is how do you ensure that your BDRs who are, probably working those inbounds initially for qualification, how do you ensure that they're actually using their time appropriately, right? One of the things that I think a lot about is sales velocity, which I think I've heard you call sales productivity, basically dollar per time, right? Dollars per unit of time. I think it's one of the most fundamental things that you need to be thinking about. And for, let's say, a BDR team, right? If you're inundated with inbounds, one of your biggest challenges is going to be how do I actually focus my time on the right opportunities that are coming to me, right? And so one of the symptoms of misallocation or poor assignment is often when you start seeing that BDR team, for example, start to miss their KPIs while still having really high activity levels, right? They're reaching out, they're doing stuff, but in the end, it's not really converting. And that could be, a problem with your ICP or something like that. But in a lot of cases, what it is that you're not keeping them focused on what I think of as the good place. If you think of like a quadrant.
Yeah, I want you to explain that because, I think that's an interesting concept you have, which is that, two primary factors you're taking into consideration in terms of evaluating, let's say, the worthiness of an opportunity at any point in time is you call fit and timing. Yeah. So fit on the y-axis, right, and timing on the x-axis.
Yeah. So, not to get too consultant-y about it. We're not a consulting company, but, consultants love quadrants, right? When you think about, I think there's two ways you need to be thinking about any opportunity. Number one is this idea of fit. How closely do they hew to your ICP, right? How likely are they to be a good candidate for your product and service? And so, if you think about that on the y-axis, right? Okay, a very good candidate's going to be up high, and a very bad one's going to be down low, right? And then the other thing you need to think about is timing. Are they actually in market for what you're selling, right? It's, you think about the standard qualification questions we ask, right? One of those is always about timing. All right, do you have a thing you need to do right now? And so if you think about timing as the x-axis, they're either, not interested at all, or they're just kicking the tires, or this is like everything's on fire and they must solve this problem. If you can keep your reps focused on those opportunities within your system that are a really good fit and have really, critical timing, then they're going to spend most of their time delivering higher sales velocity, more dollars per time, right? What happens a lot of times is when a rep gets inundated or overwhelmed in some way. And by the way, this doesn't just happen at the beginning of the sales cycle. This can happen in the middle of a sales cycle with your closers, for example. They could have too many demos that are coming in that are poorly qualified for whatever whatever reason. When they start to get inundated, everybody reaches sort of a saturation point, right? And what I've seen is rep behavior starts to get a little bit more random at that point, or just reactive. Whatever pops up next is the thing that they focus on.
They spend time, right?
Yeah, and I think so. To me, this is an example of if you're building your systems around the reps appropriately. And when I say system, I mean it in the systems theory kind of sense, not just like a technical system, but sort of the socioeconomic, like all of the things that go into an actual a system.
Not a piece of technology, but
right, not a piece of technology. People, process, technology, all that good stuff, right? And all that works together. You want to build your systems so that you're helping to enable your reps to focus, right? If your system is just designed to deliver whatever as fast as possible, what you're going to do is ultimately hurt the rep's focus. You're going to hurt sales velocity, right? And so that's one of the ways that we think about that. And so one of the sort of corollaries for that, and I think that a lot of revenue systems don't take into account is things like capacity management for sales reps, right? Like you need to think about, you need to really think book size. You need to think about whether they're able to focus
stop for a
on
second. Yeah, and define for people you're calling book. I mean,
sure.
It could be a territory, it could be a list of accounts, it could be their patch, whatever. Yep. It's what they're sort of the potential of what they're working on.
Correct. Yeah. So it's this may come through, I don't know, but I'm a technologist that fell in love with revenue systems, right? I've come to this from maybe a slightly different perspective from some people. And so, I think the way I kind of look at it is it's the queue of things that you're working on currently that are kind of in your, primary memory, if you will, right? Like the idea is like, these are the things I'm super focused on. Yeah. And so when I talk about the book, one of the reasons I use that term as opposed to like your patch or your territory is I actually think that in many cases for efficient operation of these systems, the geographic like patch/territory model is actually detrimental. So I tend to think about it as like, what do you own and what are you responsible for at this moment in time, which may or may not correlate to a set of zip codes.
No, rarely does these days anyway. Yeah.
That's true. I wish it were more true. As part of what we've done with Gradient Works is we've gone through initial product development and working on our beta currently. I've had probably 100 conversations with CROs and ops leaders in sales organizations, and certainly nothing close to the 900 plus conversations that you've had with your podcast and counting. But one of the things I hear time and again, even at like what you would think of as a fairly new SaaS company that doesn't really have any kind of geographic specificity to the product they're selling, it's the default. People still organize their teams in a lot of cases around this outdated idea that geography matters a whole heck of a lot in most of these B2B sales processes.
Yeah, which you wonder why that's the case, right? Because maybe it's just, as you said, a construct they're accustomed to dealing with. But as we move away from leads and more into account-based, there's less sense to that. I
mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's actually inefficient when you go back to this idea of systems theory and you think about, one example I like to use a lot is you think about going to the grocery store, right? And you go to the grocery store, you get your cart, and you're ready to check out. And there's a few different things you encounter when you check out, right? One is like you go through the express lane, and there's like the long line, and then there's like the 4 different people who are checking people out as you go through, right? Or you go scan the set of folks that can check you out if you have more than 15 items, right? And you go pick the shortest line and then cross your fingers and you watch everybody else go faster than you or whatever, right? And one of the, but there's actually math behind that. The most efficient way to handle a big list of things, a large queue, is to have multiple people taking from a single queue, right? You want to have that. That's why the express lanes are set up that way. And so when we do geographic territories, almost what we're saying is, like when you go up to the to check out at the grocery store, imagine there was a little clerk there who said, "Hey, what neighborhood do you live in? Oh, you have to go to this lane over here, right?" And you can imagine, pretty viscerally, I imagine, if you've waited in line at the grocery store, you can imagine like what that experience is like, both for you and the cashier who happens to have the neighborhood where everybody's shopping that day, right? And so I think that what one of the things we've identified is that for efficient operations of the operation of these revenue systems, you really have to be thinking more like that, more about the actual throughput of the system as opposed to just trying to allocate things, quote unquote, fairly, in the sense of like, well, I'm just going to try to equalize everybody's territories and give everybody a patch, right? People like that sense of ownership, but they don't like the outcome where it is impossible to get every patch to be equivalent in terms of its value. Not everything is 94104 in San Francisco, right? If you're selling to tech companies, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, but what happens still, I believe, to a large degree, especially in sort of fast-growing companies, is, how are you dealing with the issue of, you're not trying to equalize, but subtly penalizing people, right? Is that favoritism, I guess, in terms of allocation of opportunities?
Well, and so actually, I think the territory model actually lends itself more to those types of shenanigans than a model that's maybe built more around, I'll call it round robin, but I think of it as more of an intelligent round robin that tries to optimize allocations based on the capacity that reps have available. So if you think about, being penalized subtly, it could be that, well, you're going to get these zip codes or these territories, right? And that's a management decision versus we've got these inbounds or this account pool or whatever you want to look at, and we're going to allocate those out to reps based on the capacity they have available or possibly other metrics. And then we're going to ensure that that capacity is continually balanced as you go, right? And so to me, that keeps you in that good place in that fit and timing quadrant, because you can ensure that everybody is sitting by and large with a book of accounts that is generally equalized across the total amount of value, and not just what is locked up in a particular physical location.
Okay. Well, let's go through the quadrant. Let's define the boxes, because I think that what you're really leading up to is saying, look, you should actually physically identify using this quadrant where your opportunities are and use this as a guide. So if people are thinking about a quadrant, 4 boxes, upper right hand corner is what you call the good place, borrowing from the TV show. So a good fit ICP wise, good fit timing wise.
Right.
Those you stress, and I think it's a really important point, is that's temporal in terms of timing.
Right.
Lower right, false hope zone, meaning good timing, poor fit. We certainly see reps spend a lot of time on those.
Yeah, I want to spend just a minute on the false hope zone, because I think the false hope zone is a really it's pretty insidious, because I've seen a lot in let's say you're in a fairly high velocity sales motion, you're selling like a mid-market SaaS kind of product, right? And maybe you're going from I don't know, a $10,000 sales price to maybe like a $25,000 or $30,000 kind of deal, right? And you're, like most companies, trying to get that ASP up, right? And so as you get closer and closer to your month or your quarter or whatever, your sales reps are going to come to you and say, hey, like these guys really want it,
but this guy's want it.
We gotta, they're not quite the perfect fit, but I think if we get them started here, then we're gonna, the account managers are gonna be able to kind of get them to the right place, and then they're gonna grow. It's gonna be great, right? And so those are the ones that you really have to watch for, because the timing is right, and everybody is generally, you and the customer are probably willing to convince yourself that it's a good fit, right? So it's like, that's kind of the quadrant where you buy yourself churn. in the future in a lot of cases, right? And so I think that one is something you've got to be really careful about because, if you're a sales leader and you got a rep that comes, you're close to your number for the quarter, you get a rep that comes to you and it says, look, these guys want to get across the line, let's just do this. It's really hard to say no, right? Like maybe that's what gets you over the line. And it might not be even the right decision to say no, but you got to recognize the long-term implications of saying yes.
Well, so let's just pause for a second on that because this is something that's certainly sitting here on podcasts. It's really easy to say.
Right.
Resist temptation when it exists, when the difference is between perhaps making your number for the quarter as a manager or not. What guidance do you give to the manager that's, you said to your words, is buying churn at that point?
Well, so first of all, I would never sit here and tell a manager, don't make your number. Right? Like make your number. Especially, I spent a lot of my life in startups, right? And you may be buying churn, and we can talk a lot about that if we ever get into it. But you're also buying the right to continue existing. So that's one of the, so like you can't really afford if you're a startup or you're in a growth stage to defer those kinds of things too far into the future, right? You got to get the revenue now and try to figure it out later in some cases. So, so like you said, it's 100% easy to sit here on a podcast and tell somebody like, hey, you got to be cautious about this. And I think what you have to do as an organization is you have to recognize this dynamic. And it's one of the reasons why I believe that, a CRO or a VP of sales probably needs to own the entire customer lifecycle. They need to own new logos and they need to own retention because at some point there's got to be a person, and it probably can't be the CEO because they're too distracted in the end by other facets of the company. You got to have somebody who owns that entire revenue number across the board. Because I think that they need to understand that if they're writing a check today, it's their butt that's going to cash the check tomorrow. And if you do that, you create at least a little bit of a balancing out of that equation.
But I think one of the goals with this quadrant, instead of we've described the good place, the upper right, good fit, good timing. Now we're false hope zone, lower right. People picturing this, we're moving. Yeah.
Hard to do this on a podcast, isn't it?
Doing clockwise. Good timing, poor fit. But the goal is that because I wrote about from a different perspective, but I really believe it really helps. In my first book, I talk about creating a quadrant to actually plot your opportunities on the quadrant. Yeah, is because even within good timing, good fit in the good place, there's a difference between being in the lower left-hand corner of that quadrant or the upper right-hand corner. So I really urge people as we start talking through this is think about this visually and just write simple on a piece of paper and just put a ink dot where you think this prospect is and be very realistic about it because this will give you a sense to say, okay, is this worth pursuing at this time? Because I think the scenario you described was, this one sort of came in the door with like 2 weeks left to go in the quarter, and we were able to move it through the process really quickly. But if they came in the first week of the quarter, you'd probably make a different decision on it.
Right. Yep. And if they're still hanging around at the end of the quarter, you might make yet another different decision.
That's right. Well, but unfortunately, that's one of the things that you want to try to manage as a coach is that your sellers are going to keep those around. Yeah. And they do have the opportunity otherwise to go out and find and work with better opportunities. I think this is what you're talking about is ideally, you always have choices, right? Unless you're really lean in terms of opportunity. But you're always making decisions, right? Win rates are such, they're relatively low, which means they're burning through lots of opportunities in a month. Who's to say you made the right decision up front about which ones to work on? And so I see this as an interesting tool to use as sort of I don't want to say qualification, let's say screening. Right. Regardless of what the BDR, SDR says. If you're an AE, I would create this quadrant, and we'll go through the other two parts. And I would be marking everyone saying, okay, for the quarter, this is where these all fell. Yeah.
I think that, I think about this a lot from a systems perspective, sort of as, sort of looking down at the whole system. But what's nice about this is it really does give you that ability as an individual rep. You can look at it at any level, right? All the way down to your individual rep, evaluating exactly what you've got on your plate right now, all the way up to, the CRO trying to think through, like, where are we in the quarter as a whole? So
Right.
yeah, I think it can be really useful to just start dotting this down, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, I encourage it. So let me just finish the last two quadrants then. Lower left-hand corner, that's the bad place, bad timing, bad fit. And then in the upper left-hand corner, get back to me. Those are good fit, bad timing.
Yeah, and those are, I've seen reps spend a lot of time trying to push timing, right? Like you see they're a good fit, but and to some degree that's their job, right? But it's really easy to it's easy to get happy ears around timing, or to otherwise try to think, well, all right, my POC seems really excited about this, but they're hearing back from somebody else that, like, this isn't something they can prioritize right now. But I think if I just give them this information, they can kind of push it up the chain and we can move them forward. And so it's a better place to be, right? Especially if you're really conscious of how you manage it, because as long as somebody's a good fit, and I think you mentioned account-based marketing earlier, and I think ABM is the way that you need to do things. You need to be focused on the account, right? And so one of the interesting things I think about ABM is that it's very much not a transactional way of thinking about the world. You're going to get multiple at-bats with a particular account as they move through, changes in their business and that kind of thing. So it's important for you to be talking to folks to a certain degree who are good fits, but not necessarily the right timing, so that you can get intelligence about what is the right timing, so that when that timing comes up, there you are. And so you want some of the behavior to happen in this quadrant for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you look at like building your bench of prospects. I mean, you have to, you got to sell prospects next month and the month after and the month after,
Right.
and you got to have those conversations. You can't wait till they're actually in market to initiate those conversations. I mean, if you're doing that, it's great intelligence to have, but ideally, especially in an account-based world, you're talking to those opportunities and you're developing those accounts, assuming your book of business is not too big, and you address that. You should be working them all anyway.
Yeah. And I think another reason to really think about the capacity management problem, right? If you've got, and if you're overwhelmed by a whole bunch of, kind of irrelevant stuff as a rep, then you don't have the opportunity to be strategic in that regard of, like, thinking about what's my pipeline going to look like 2 quarters out when these contracts that, these companies have with my competitor are going to come up, right?
Yeah, well, I think a scenario I was thinking about in terms of the quadrant being really useful is again, because of more apps like Sixth Sense and others that are doing the in-market signals that they're providing for marketers and for sellers, is that there's a temptation to think that, well, they're in market and they're identified as one of my accounts, thus they must be a good fit.
Right. Yeah. And that's where you that's where you end up in that false hope zone, and you have reps try to convince themselves that they're not in the zone of false hope, right? That, oh yeah, sure, it's a good fit. They're really a good fit, right? That's why I wanted to spend some time on that one, because I think it really is a great place to get stuck. And it can be found. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because you think one signal equals 2. It's not the case at all.
Right.
Well, so you also mentioned this, you'd written a good article I'd read about this whole concept of the fit and timing, which I really liked. And you talked about that sales orgs need to put some guardrails in place to keep reps focused. I was going to change the order of the ones that you had listed and talk about it. And lead off with the fact that they have to reduce the size of the business book that the sellers are responsible for. And I'm a huge believer in the theory of constraints in growing sales. And I don't think that narrowing the number of accounts is a constraint that's difficult. I think it's a constraint that forces you to do a better job.
Yeah. And I'm glad, somehow I thought we might not get through this conversation without bringing up Goldratt and theory of constraints and that sort of thing. So I'm happy that you did, because I think what gets fascinating for me is when you start thinking about this type of, fit and timing, and you start breaking down all the places in your sales organization where one team or one role or whatever feeds another role. When you start connecting these different components together, right? Because each one of these has all of the same challenges at every stage. So you've got your demand generation, right, which is trying to do a version of this and make sure that the folks who are, inbound are the right kind of folks, and that they, they have some kind of interest. Then you've got your BDRs who are doing the same thing. And if you break it down to people who are handling inbound versus people who are handling outbound, you've got your outbound teams who are usually probably kind of inefficiently, but doggedly going out and trying to find folks who are ideally they're working with a book that's you think is a reasonable ICP or reasonable fit, right? And then they're trying to go kind of figure out timing and some of those components. And then those folks are usually feeding, some closers if you're in sort of a standard. I'll say standard, but kind of that sort of B2B.
Let's call them sellers. I hate the closer thing.
Sellers, okay, that's fine.
In general, they're horrible closers, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's true. Another conversation, but then and then from there, like they have this same kind of issue, right? And then you get into I don't want to say post-sales because it's never post-sales. It's sort of after the initial close, right?
Right.
You think about onboarding, and then you think about customer success or whatever that looks like, and you think about your account management function and your renewals. Each one of those has kind of a version of this, and then you connect all those pieces together, and you end up with, I think, a very classic kind of theory of constraints type model where you have, someone's output feeding someone's input, and then you have to look at the throughput of the entire system and start backtracking and trying to find your bottlenecks, right? And sometimes that can lead to bottlenecks in kind of strange places, right? Like you think most of the time, right? Like, well, we're not hitting our number, so what we really need is more leads, right? We need more inbound. But, if those sellers, if they're not actually, doing what they need to do, they may be your bottleneck. And I mean, in some cases, I've actually seen the bottleneck happen at onboarding, right? Like you screw up your initial time to value because you're not getting folks onboarded well enough. And that
well, talking about customers in this case, not getting customers onboarded. Yeah. The constraints, when you think about that, because everything is interrelated, as you said, the constraint could be something as simple as, we're doing a really lousy job of messaging on outbound about what we do. And, we're having to suddenly fall into what sounds like a pitch, right? So those first calls aren't very effective. You're not getting a lot of meetings set up, or when you get meetings set up, we don't meet expectations subsequent because we did such a poor job messaging beforehand. And you sort of have to address them one by one. And, I find especially in early stage companies, as you're trying to grow, is that the constraint is rarely having enough salespeople. It's usually up the chain further, right?
Right. What's interesting about that is I also do see one, you talk to so let's say that our pitch isn't, or our talk track isn't working well in that, outbound that we're doing, right? We identify that. What I do see happen a lot, and this again goes back to Goldratt and theory of constraints, is a lot of times if you're a CRO and you're tasked with the number, right? The velocity number, depending, you can measure it however you want from a time perspective, but you need to produce a certain number of dollars every quarter, right? Like that's what you're supposed to do. And so a lot of times what happens is somebody will pick they'll pick some sort of local measurement and say local versus global, right? And they'll say well, our BDRs just aren't, they're not, the meeting rate is just not what we need it to be. right? And they start, going and yelling at those BDRs without a full understanding
Hmm.
of exactly how that impacts the rest of the system. So I mean, it's kind of the
Right.
classic theory of constraints. Like I go optimize this thing over here and nothing happens. Well, it's because it wasn't actually your
The
bottleneck.
problem. Right.
And I think one of the challenges that we've got with many of the tools that we have, and this is something we're thinking a lot at Gradient Works about, is we don't have a great way of understanding how opportunities flow through our systems, through our revenue organizations in many cases. When I say opportunities, I don't mean it in the pure like Salesforce sense. I mean it as like opportunity in the sense of these are opportunities for selling or for expanding an account or whatever. We often don't have a great way of modeling how these things flow kind of horizontally through our
Hmm.
systems, and so we end up building things like everyone does, like a static quota capacity model, for
Right.
example, that just says like I'm going to take a bunch of averages and I'm going to plug those in, and that's going to spit out how many heads I need, right?
Right.
But it doesn't really tell you in detail how these things actually flow through the system, and you can never
Right.
really find your bottlenecks that way if you don't understand the interconnectivity. And I think that's a missing piece in the kind of the toolkit that a CRO needs.
Tell me about it. This is one I've been pushing for a long time.
Yeah.
And it requires a little more work, though a lot of it can be automated these days. But you have to capture the time that people are spending on tasks,
Hmm.
and the individual as well as the team. And the example I give, and because we were doing this all manually back a while ago, uh, but a startup was with a is now quite a large company, but at the time we were sub $100 million, but still growing quickly and pretty sizable. Is basically if you were a salesperson, if you had a qualified opportunity, we created a job number for it, and you charge your time to a job number. So if
Oh
you're on the
wow.
phone with a
Okay.
customer, you charge time to it. If a SE was talking to the customer, they charged their time to it. So you knew exactly how much time it took you, both
Hmm.
the individual seller as well as organizationally, to move a deal through from start to finish. And we just measured it. Initially, I was concerned. I wasn't concerned about the post. I was concerned about up to the order. But yeah, to me, that's productivity, right? When you understand you've got a rate of output per units of input, and then you can start actually saying, okay, well, looking across this last year, it seems to be that it takes us, just say, 50 hours of time across the organization on average to bring $1 million opportunity through the pipeline. Now you can
Right.
start making predictions about your capacity, right? And what you're actually able to achieve if you set your systems up properly.
And I think so what's interesting about that, right, is I think there's two ways of measuring time. One is sort of, I'll call it active time. You're actually doing this thing, right,
Mm-hmm.
during this point in time. And then the other I'll just sort of like call wall time. And, you look at the clock and this is how much time has passed between, point A and point B, right? And so
Sure.
one of the things that I think is important here is if you only are looking at sort of those time slices, and you're not thinking about the actual kind of wall clock time of how long it takes to get from point A to point B, you're going to miss the points at which you have latency that are dragging down your throughput, right? So like where people aren't responding to things, or where your rep is working on another opportunity, and so there's an opportunity cost to that, right? And
Sure.
so I think you've got to be looking at all of those things. And again, in the end, if you roll it up to the CRO, right, you've got 90 days to go get however many millions of dollars you're supposed to get, right? And that's kind of how you're measured and how people think about what you're supposed to do, right? And so as you get down to those granular kind of active time slices, I think you're going to miss some of the latencies that happen in the system.
Perhaps,
Yeah.
perhaps. But I mean, on the other hand, though, at least you're starting at a point where you're saying, look, when you're at the time that you have control over, when you're actually
Mhm.
doing something,
Right.
what does it produce?
Right. And
Right?
I think that's super important for sure.
I mean, I think we'd be better off from one perspective to say, geez, as sellers, let's say take your BDR time as, okay, we've got activity metrics we want them to hit. But I would contend that if we found a way to analyze to say, look, these calls don't ever lead to an outcome, right? A productive outcome. Therefore, they're not productive calls. How do we minimize the number of calls that don't lead to a productive output? I mean, I draw the factory analogy, right? I mean, if and more, this is not about BDR per se, but in sales in general, is, if you have a factory and you have the capability of producing 100 widgets an hour, but you produce 80, but 20 of them need to be reworked before they can go back out again. What's your productivity? It's not 100, it's not 80, it's 60. Yet people are looking at productivity for BDRs and saying, well, 50 calls a day or whatever, that's their productivity. And I would say, well, that's not their productivity, that's just the activity. Let's now start looking at productivity. And yeah, I know it's a bridge too far for many people, but we're starting to have the data available. The other performance-based professions, and I always default to talking about soccer because that's, you can use the data to analyze these things to a much greater degree than we are. And we have a lot of information there that we're just not surfacing.
Yeah, and I unfortunately I can't speak to soccer, but I'm a basketball stats kind of person, and the performance, the level of detail that we've started to get to over the past few years in terms of thinking about what actually produces outcomes is really fascinating. And I think, but one of the things that I think is interesting about that, you mentioned like doing some of this by hand or then being able to start tracking these things via the system that you were using before. I kind of feel like I'm going to use a term I think that you don't love, which is modern sales. But here's what I think modern sales actually is, and I actually view the sales, the revenue organizations we have today are undergoing a transformation similar to what manufacturing organizations underwent in the 70s and 80s with lean manufacturing. I think what we're seeing is the qualitative changes that happen when technology reaches a certain threshold, that when you have a technology-enabled system, like we were talking about before, not the tech system, but the people and the process and the technology all working together, when you get to a certain threshold of the amount of data, the interconnectedness of the data, how the systems actually are utilized on a day-to-day basis to do the job, you start to be able to control things in a really different way. You go to like the Toyota production system, right, started being developed based off the Ford systems in the 30s, and so they did it very manually. But eventually, when you get into the 70s and 80s, all of a sudden, you get into kind of like the gold time frame, right? You start to be able to do these things with computers, right? And so you start to be able to manage workflows throughout the entire system. The machines start to give you data, so you can start building out like simulations of how those machines are going to work with, work in the system. I think that we've reached a level of technology underpinnings of the sales function, the revenue function, that it actually is starting to look a lot like those kinds of inflection points for manufacturing. And so you can start to think a lot more about how do you utilize that technology layer to actually impact the behavior of the system as a whole versus just as sort of a glorified like data collection mechanism.
I think that's the desired outcome. My belief is we're not anywhere close to that yet. But we have the tools and stuff in place to begin to do that. Because unfortunately we're running out of time here, but I just leave it with this thought because I've asked a number of people this from different walks and, from academia and other places is, go back to this measure that I talked about before is, revenue generated per hour of selling time. Is there's no data that exists that I've seen or that anybody else has seen that I've asked that says, given the explosion of technology into sales over the last 10, 20 years, that number has changed over that period of time. So, and I think that's what we got to be aiming for, is that, yeah, we have all this technology. Now let's use it in a way so that when people actually engaged with the buyer, they can help the buyer, they can more effective, help the buyer make their decisions better, and so on, so that that number actually improves. And it ideally should improve, right? So...
And I do wonder, though, are we measuring, and I know we're about to run out of time here, but
Yeah.
I think if you think about it from a global systems level as opposed to a local optimization level, I think there's probably some evidence that the use of technology has enabled us to produce more revenue at the systems level. When you look at the number of the number of massive companies with large valuations and steadily
Wow.
increasing revenues, right? It's hard to track that back to
Yeah.
how much of that is driven by technology change versus market size. So it's not an easy answer.
Right. Yeah, it'd be fun to talk about that, but we'll have to do it another time because, I think it's a topic worth discussing because I think this is the way that we measure. It should be measuring sales going forward as opposed to unit-based quotas and things we do today. So, whole different discussion. So, anyway,
Yes.
Hayes, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been fun.
If people want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
I'd suggest LinkedIn. I'm Hayes
Perfect.
Davis on LinkedIn. Easy to find me.
Perfect. All right, Hayes, look forward to doing it again.
All right, sounds great.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, we're so grateful for your support of this show. And I want to thank my guest, Hayes Davis, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you could also leave us a rating or a review and let us know how we're doing, well, we'd appreciate that. You can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this episode is over. So thank you for your help. And as always, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.